Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy you're able to join us. I'm not sure where you may be, but we're getting closer to that day of spring, which will be Sunday. And also we do have the extra hour of light in the evening, and we have vaccines coming in. And so hopefully we're looking at moving on the other side of the current situation that we're in. And when I say that, I don't just mean the pandemic, but all the other things that we have come to notice because of the pandemic. As we now seeing in the States, and we've seen across the North America, the anti-Asian hate and violence, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and so on. I almost think this is a time for planetary healing, and that COVID has given us a slap in the face as a major wake-up. And so all these other issues that have been plaguing us for years seem to be coming up at the same time. Let's hope we're moving on the other side and transforming, as opposed to just trying to return to what some people call normal, which we never did. And so part of that is our work with you this afternoon and the series we've run over the past number of months since September, I guess. And we're coming to our last two sessions today and next week. And we really appreciate those who have come to a number of sessions. We know it's a lot of work with figuring out digital and how best to use it, how best to access it, and how to build whatever it is one is doing. So within that spirit, I want to start today with a land acknowledgement, and then thank our presenters today for the work they'll be doing with you. In terms of a land acknowledgement, as we know, we are on Indigenous land. That's North America, Turtle Island, in particular Taikaranto, where we are right now situated. Taikaranto, the area where the trees grow out of the water, and the agreement that had been in place between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee called the Dish with One Spoon. There are many people who've come through this territory, the Mississauga, the Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and others who are perhaps not known to us, but certainly this has been a meeting ground. And the idea of the Dish with One Spoon, as we understand it, was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, which is, I think, something that we try to emulate through CPAMO's work about how do we look at resources that are available, who should have access to them. So with the Dish with One Spoon, we understand that whoever had a need from this part of the earth would be able to take what they needed. But they also needed to had a responsibility, and that responsibility is to make sure that the earth was left for others who had need, not just now, but into the future. And the recognition that the earth is so important to how we live. Without what the earth provides us, we would not have oxygen. We would not have plant life, which means we would not have fruit, we would not have vegetables, which means, again, the wildlife that we do take in for either food or other forms of sustenance, or as people we care for, pets and so on, would not be here either. So there's a lot of reasons to understand the importance of the relationship to Mother Earth, because Mother Earth gives us life. And I think that that's at the root of the Dish with One Spoon, and is the sense we take of it today is how do we in the arts community transform our world from one of competitiveness to one of sharing, from one of it's about me to one of it's about a community, to one of it's about what I want to get done to what can we get done together so we understand each other better and we can basically participate together and live up to what we hope the people in this country can truly be. And so for us, that's about how do we share the resources that we have, how do we articulate what we need, and how do we make sure that we all arrive together, which is critical at this point in time. I think if the one thing COVID is teaching us is that we need to really deal with each other with respect, and also to deal with all sentient beings and non-sentient, if there are such things, in the same way. So I want to leave that with you as we start this session, because clearly digital is a mode of communication, creation, etc., that's going to be with us. And so we want to make sure that the artists groups that we work with, Indigenous, Black, people of color, other marginalized artists, those who are deaf and disabled, and so on, are part of this new world in cyberspace, and can work with organizations like we're here today with the Canadian Opera Company, the National Ballet. Last month we had the Culture Brew. Before that we had Tangled Arts, and we started this all off with Jessa Gilo and Arts Pond. We've brought all these resources together so they can share what they're learning with you and with others.
I just wanted to take a moment to just acknowledge the really beautiful land acknowledgement that Charles offered, and say that it really helps me ground my own engagement and how I engage with the land and engage with new communities and work in service of the arts community. We'll have a conversation between Stephen and Chris, who will walk you through some of the technologies that we're using to help us with our connectivity between buildings. After that, we're hoping we'll have an artist joining us, Joel Ivany of Against the Grain Theatre, to talk a little bit about his experience with engaging technology in the creative process. Then we'll have a quick break and then reconvene to answer some questions, and a really, really valuable one we got in advance of this conversation that really helped me frame the answer in advance, so that we'll spend a little time unpacking that question and talking a little bit about what future engagement looks like, and then we'll go back into a facilitated conversation with our project manager, Alex Hocevar. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen and Chris. Thank you.
So thank you everybody for joining us. We wanted to talk about how people are collaborating together sort of in the pandemic period, and looking sort of at the journey, where we came from, where we are now, and where we think we're going to in the future. And I thought it might be helpful to sort of touch on a few of the things that Canadian Opera Company certainly made use of in the early days, and try to draw some parallels perhaps with what your own organizations experienced. I would like just to say as well that we'd like to keep this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions or comments that you'd like us to speak to during this portion of the afternoon, please do make use of the chat functionality to send your questions through. And Alex, I'll rely on you, please, to monitor that and perhaps pose the questions as they come in. So I think in the very early days, when none of us could come together anymore, we were all reeling and really just trying to look for any tools that were readily available. And certainly our organization made quite significant use of tools like the one we're using today initially, Zoom, Teams, and tools like it to come together. And we experimented in the early days with trying to leverage these tools to collaborate. We create music, obviously, though it's with action on stage as well. But one of the very first things you have to get right with opera is the music itself. And when you have performers in different locations, one of the biggest challenges you face is the difference of time between those participants. So what we refer to as latency. So if I'm participating, if I'm singing, and my colleague Chris is also singing with me, we may think that we're beginning and ending at the exact same moment, but because of the nature of the internet and the hardware we may be using, we're going to be just ever so slightly out of synchronization the best we try, and that doesn't result in a great experience. I'm sure many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And even if you haven't had that experience together making music, perhaps you've experienced it in a meeting where you have difficulty interjecting what you are trying to say with somebody else on the same call, and you end up speaking over someone unintentionally because of that sort of inherent latency to the system. So one of the things we started looking at was how can we, maintain the experience, but improve the end result. And initially, the thought was, well, the only way we can really do this is to provide all of the musicians, whether they're singers or instrumentalists, with some sort of a click track to sing or play along with, and then record that, and then everyone would sort of send that video material back to be edited in post-production, we all stitched together, and you'd be left with that sort of Brady Bunch style performance where you have one box appear and then another and then another. Unfortunately, that really wasn't a live performing experience, and all of the participants, whether you're talking about the musicians themselves or the audience, could perceive perhaps that it wasn't really a live piece. It was still an extraordinary undertaking, and I think for the organizations that found that useful, it was a great way of keeping in touch with their respective communities. And certainly, I don't mean to suggest that it's not a useful tool. I think it certainly is. It's just something that's not what we would consider live. So we continue to sort of explore around this idea. How can we continue to make live music? And we came along the idea that really, if we explore the idea of decoupling the video and the audio, could that work? And certainly our young artists were working on a variety of projects, and we're exploring tools like Clean Feed, like SoundJack. These are tools that are web-based that allow you to connect an audio feed at extreme low latency with very minimal hardware or software requirements for the end user, and then use something like Zoom or Skype or FaceTime to have that sort of video reference. But really, you were all about trying to create a superior music making experience by having the audio in sync, and that worked well to a certain extent, and has sort of brought us to where we find ourselves today. And I will bring this slide up on screen if I can. Are you all seeing the conceptual architecture slide? Yeah. So working through a funded project by Canada Council for the Arts, we've created what we're referring to as the Performing Arts Digital Lab, or PADL. And one of the pilot projects PADL is looking at is around this idea of collaboration, of being able to make music, being able to collaborate through any of the number of different performing arts to come together. And one of the things that we identified and what I touched on through my initial comments was this idea of latency, and the idea of being able to bring participants together in a way that they could make a meaningful experience both for themselves and for the public. And we recognize that, one of the crucial pieces underpinning all of that was lacking was connectivity. And is there a way then that we as a community could come together to form a network to overcome this current limitation? And so again, as an initial step, the Canadian Opera Company, National Ballet have decided to run a pilot. We're hoping actually to partner with Sheridan College as well, who find themselves on the same internet provider or same network carrier as our two organizations, to form something we're referring to as ArtsNet. And this is a piece of infrastructure to link performing arts institutions together at ultra low latency. And I'll use another technical term called jitter as well. So if latency is the amount of time it takes for your data to get from point A to B, jitter is the amount of variation that exists in that latency from one moment to the next. So you might have a low latency connection, but maybe there's wide swings in that latency. And that's almost as bad as having really high latency. In fact, a higher latency but lower jitter connection is preferable, because then at least the information is more predictable about when it will be sent and received. So apologies for the bit of technical jargon there, but I wanted to explain that a bit. So ultra low latency and jitter network connectivity to underpin the actual bit of collaboration. The other thing we sort of were wondering about was whether we could build this network out into the larger community. And so we are exploring that idea as well. But again, for the initial pilot, we're looking at the Four Seasons Center for the Performing Arts, the head offices for the Canadian Opera Company, and the head offices for the National Ballet of Canada, along with our partners at Sheridan College. So we hope to be able to leverage both audio and video infrastructure that exists at those locations, or will exist in the very near future through a linked project, and look at how that low latency network can really move things forward. I will say as well, there's a few projects that are looking at that situation I mentioned previously about decoupling audio and video, and they're fundamentally leveraging the same approach, but creating a more ubiquitous platform for the end user or musician. So they're offering both audio and video services under a single umbrella, but they are technically still not the same platform. But at that, I think I'll pass the baton to Chris to speak about some of the technologies that are sort of being explored next.
There's a number of different technologies that are available, and Stephen talked about this sort of mutual service provider. There's a company in the Toronto area called Beanfield. Beanfield has slowly been gobbling up a number of different providers, and they're extensive through Toronto. And what we discovered is that both organizations are using a Beanfield connection. And so when we did some testing, we discovered that we were within milliseconds of each other in terms of latency, a significant low latency connection that it made this whole entire idea plausible. The question now comes, what technologies are we going to use, or what technology should we employ to allow us? And the idea is, a distributed orchestra is a perfect example. Being able to have, because we can't have 60 people in a room together playing because of the lockdown issues, could we have 10 people in 6 different buildings working together with the conductor and actually playing together? And so this idea of how can we create a distributed environment, and what type of technologies can we use? So there's currently 3 that we're looking at. The first one being, and I think if you can see my screen, it's ArtMesh. ArtMesh is essentially it's a peer-to-peer network. I think the hurdle that we're going to have to go through, the difficulty, is that in the initial setup, a lot of these things are going to be fairly technical, and being able to just have individuals connect in from home and from different locations might be prohibitive. So the hope is that we can find something that's a little easier to use, so that it's possible for non-technical people very easily to connect into what needs to be done. So ArtMesh, and we're still exploring a lot of these technologies. It's a downloadable application that allows you to create a peer-to-peer network. So it'll be one of the areas that we'll give it a try and see how we can do this creation. It doesn't provide video. It is strictly an audio peer-to-peer connection. So low latency audio between, so that you can work together and pump sound over distances. It does have a fairly large range, but that's still dependent on the technology or the connectivity that you have. The next one we're looking at is, and I believe this comes out of MIT, is JackTripp. And JackTripp actually is a technology based on the Jack control system that's part of the Linux operating system. So in Linux, you have an inherent tool that JackTripp set up so that you can have these, essentially these servers. And so the way JackTripp works is that you can, and they're partnered with Amazon, you can go into one of the Amazon locations that they have around North America, and you can create a free audio server. Depending on how much you're going to use it, they're going to start charging depending on the level of activity on it, but that's still in the works. So you essentially spin up a server, and when I say that, you literally just say, create server, give it a name, and then you tell people what that name is. It's super easy. But the idea behind it is you can spin up a server in a different location, and then you can have individuals connect through the JackTripp or the Jack audio system so that you can stream audio between the different locations to a centralized server. This one is really quite interesting because it actually, in order to deal with latency issues, you actually get an external piece of hardware. And let's see if I can pull that up here. I purchased this one. For those who know anything about technology, it's based on a small microcomputer called a Raspberry Pi. But you can buy this, it's under $200. It has a little web interface. You plug it in, you log into a web page, and you tell it what server to connect to, and then you have your audio ports, and you just connect in, and that's how you start pumping your music through to whatever the Jack server is. So as far as a maintenance or operating, an application for operating, this one's probably one of the simplest to use. And same thing, it's all based on low latency, but it's also made for home use too. So as long as you have a really good internet connection at home, you should be able to connect up with it. So this is one of the other tools that we're going to take a look at and test out. I have ordered one of these units, and we're going to give it a try. And then the last one is, this one is spread out actually quite a bit through Europe, and it's the LOLA project. This one I haven't delved into too much. You have to email them. It's all free. You email them, you let them know what institution or where you're from, and they will send you a license. And then you can download the equipment and you can set up your own low latency. And it's the same thing. It's a peer-to-peer network. And this one's been running for a while. And they have, if you go through the LOLA site, and I'll actually put the links into the chat. LOLA's been around for quite a while, and they've been using it quite a bit. So LOLA's the last one, and I think that is, and you'll see here's LOLA. The only instance of LOLA, or the only two in Toronto, are the one I set up and Humber College. And if you start to spread out, you'll see it's all over the U.S. and then quite a bit within Europe. So LOLA's been around for a while, so it seems to be a much more robust system. So those are the ones that we're going to try out, but the idea is to create this low latency network with this simplified, ready-to-use software so that we can create this ArtsNet concept to allow for better connectivity amongst groups so that you can do distributed recording and music and playing and performances. And that's it. All right, let me, in the chat window, I will, and those are the links to the different technology packages. There's still more out there, and we're going to keep taking a look at them, but those are the ones we're initially going to start with, I think.
Joel, before I pass it over to you, I'd just like to introduce you. Joel is the artistic director of Against the Grain Theater, a company that is near and dear to my own heart. I served on the board for 6 years, and I'm thrilled to see that company continue to grow and have a real impact on the Canadian Opera Company, or rather the Canadian opera sector and the Canadian Opera Company. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Joel, and he's going to talk a little bit about how he's integrating technology into his own creative process.
So it's wonderful to be able to talk to you a little bit today about how technology has played a role in my art practice and how that intersects with opera. I am an opera director and an administrator, and I'm just going to see if I can do the two things at once where I can, yeah, there we go. This share sound. Great. Let's see if that works. Yeah, okay. So basically, opera is a very old, traditional art form. It's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's interesting to see how technology can play a role in the development of opera, meaning, again, lighting, for example, used to be candles. And then electricity became a thing. And then all of a sudden we don't need candles, we can use electricity. And then all of a sudden we don't need to necessarily pull ropes because technology means that you can push a button and the rope is pulled for you. So there's wonderful ways in which practically technology has come to play a role in the development of how we can produce and interact with opera and the performing arts and just art in general. And then there's other ways in which we're just kind of trying to figure it out right now. And that's the kind of crux in terms of, I've found that personally, the ability to play and the ability to interact with gear technology without the pressure of having to meet a deadline or a finished product, it's not that often, and there's not that many centers where you can do that openly, sort of, and freely. It's kind of like you sometimes have to apply to something or book yourself in or. So, and without that interaction, without that sort of hands-on experience with technology, it's really hard to know what it can do for you. So I've got a couple different productions from works that I've done in the last few years and sort of workshops that I've been a part of that has allowed me to kind of get to know certain aspects of technology a little bit more. And one of those, I'm an independent stage director. As Amy said, I'm also running an opera company in the city called Against the Grain Theatre in Toronto. And then I'm also the artistic director of opera at BAM Centre, which is in Alberta, where they're a place that has, where I've found you can kind of really play with ideas and you can really fall on your face and make big mistakes and you're not going to get in trouble for doing them. And so part of that, it was in February of 2018, we were able to present a 3-week workshop called Bridging Realities, which looked at the intersection between virtual reality, opera, and virtual reality, augmented reality, and opera. And we brought together a faculty of tech people, a faculty of opera people, and then participants from opera people and participants of tech people. And we brought them together to see what would happen when we kind of look at things, when we try things, and when we kind of learn more about it together and then kind of play around and see what could happen. And for a lot of us, we were pretty confident in what we knew, whether that was opera or whether that was computers and motion capture, but there was a lot of people who didn't know much about opera and kind of vice versa. So it took some getting to know each other because these were also participants and faculty from not just Canada, but from the US and France, Brazil. So it was kind of a great intersection of cultures, of people, and obviously different ways of talking about what we can do. There's a picture you can see about, we were looking at various things from like the Google Cardboard glasses to Oculus, different headsets for motion capture, as well as 360 cameras. And we spent the first week just looking at what exists online. And this was, again, 2018. So this is a couple years ago already, about what exists out there in terms of opera and VR and AR in terms of its intersection. So we spent a week about lectures, and then we kind of got into more hands-on. And we took over a building where we had sort of a room, which is, you can kind of see there, where we had different stations for motion captures and taped out areas where we could try things. And then we also had another sort of green screen / TV studio where we were, and a piano to kind of play with how we could do different things that way. And that's kind of what the focus was for the second and third week together, of trying things. There were a lot of kind of opera people who didn't really like technology because of its the way it could maybe hinder and get in the way of just the beauty of what opera is. And again, it's kind of like opera's it's kind of made its name on unamplified. So it's like not using technology, just your voice and or an orchestra, stringed sort of sound. But again, we all gathered there to kind of see what was possible and kind of experimented and played. One of those situations was we looked at social VR as well. And for example, we put some people in one room, and they were an avatar, and kind of, and then we projected them into another room, and we kind of played with even the idea of conducting. And so here's a short little video clip of someone who you'll see their arm conducting, and that is a real human in another room, and then seeing, is it possible, example. I just heard a little bit about what Chris was saying, but can you make music that way? And this is sort of a 45-second clip of that sort of experimentation. Let's see if this works. And so there you go. Great. So that was one kind of way. And what we found even with that was how, due to latency, it was more that the opposite was kind of happening in terms of like you want to follow the conductor, but it's more that the conductor was following because he could hear what Topher was playing. So it was kind of not exactly the rights. It looked like it worked because it did, but it's not exactly the way you necessarily want it to work in the more traditional sense. So it caused a way to sort of say how, I think the one big takeaway from this experience was how, again, a lot of the time you're waiting for tech to reset, to reformat, or we have to reboot the computer because there was a malfunction or something. And so in that way, in opera, without tech, you get things automatically right away. I want you to sing this. Okay, they sing. Whereas if you want to try things sometimes, that makes it a little more difficult to kind of interact and kind of set things up. Yeah? Yeah. And so that was one big takeaway that we learned from there. We produced a small video as well that, again, I'll just play a little bit now for you to see, but we, for example, looked at the intersection of, we took a very famous opera like Labo M, which maybe you may have heard of, written by Puccini, and it was about sort of music and writing, and there's a famous aria called the Coat aria, and so you'll see little traces of this in this short little video as well, which kind of highlights a little bit of the testing that we did during those 3 weeks. Bit of the Coat aria where someone played with a 360 camera outdoors. The other one was one where you approach Rodolfo's writing book and you can hear the music depending how close you get. We also played with animation as well, and just knowing how long things take. It's not something you can do quickly, but it takes time and it takes planning, and that's sort of something that we all want to do, but again, even in this pandemic, we're learning that planning does not always equate to a reality as well. But that was, again, what triggered my mind in terms of what we can do and what we could do with this art form. That is, again, our company, and what I love doing is taking things that are old and making them new. That led to envisioning how that could look for an entire production. And in one piece that I did, it was called Orphe, and I added a little plus at the end, because it's not exactly the Orphe that people may know, but this is a French Baroque opera written by Gluck, who kind of wanted to change the way opera was done in his time, and he sort of made it shorter. He made it very dramatic. He took away sort of big sort of pageantry elements and sort of had a very simple story about a man who has lost his wife, and he'll go to hell and back to grab her and bring her back to life. So it's based on sort of the Orpheus myth. And what we did was we wanted to look at how technology could play a part in reimagining this whole opera as well. That led to, again, a workshop, which I was, again, lucky enough to be a part of at Banff Center after the VR workshop, where we played with a digital chorus, for example. And so we played with, could you have a digital chorus where people are submitting vocal tracks, which again were kind of the rage of early 2020 pandemic, but people submitting videos and stitching that together, and what does it sound like? So in this workshop, we did a little test where you'll see sort of on the left or the right was Shimon, our Orphe, a countertenor. He's there present, and we were able to kind of film 4-part verses, and this is kind of what it sounded like as a test. There's even a wonderful Joel participating in this test, but we said, what would happen if you took 4 populated an entire screen of a chorus, and is that something that you could do? And not only do, but like you're able to recreate this methodology night after night. It's in some ways more reliable, even though technology is known to sometimes being less reliable. So that experiment proved that there is something to do with even experimenting with the music. And so then we looked at Orphe. What about the evolution technologically in music as well? And here's an example of an electric guitar, which is sort of like a stringed instrument, except you blast technology through it. You blast electricity through it, and it produces a new sound and a different sound. And we sort of replaced sort of the harp, and we commissioned a new arrangement of this orchestra to have a smaller arrangement and to have new instruments to sort of support the sound. And so here's a little excerpt. We also brought in sound effects, which are not part of this traditional opera as well. So we brought in sounds in the second act. Orpheus descends into hell to find, and he meets all these sort of kind of spirits that are kind of holding around. And so it was kind of, well, what does hell sound like? And so we kind of experimented with what the sound of that could look like. And so here's a little excerpt of just the sound of what we played with as well. Kind of fun to hear that kind of done differently as well. And that's kind of, again, a different form of technology, which we haven't seen as much of taking old and making that new, but that's something that I like to do with, partly because the composer won't get too upset with you because he's dead, and partly because there's no copyright issues around it, so you can do it, and you're legally allowed to do that. And then you're also bringing to life this story in a new way for people who either love this opera or love opera, but then also new audiences as well who may be willing to listen to hearing a new sound. So we took that and then we combined projections with mapping on a simple, we had 3 walls with some really stringy kind of fabric. It was kind of not the most expensive, but when you integrate the idea of technology and projections right from the inception of an idea, you have a lot more freedom and creativity in sort of what you can put on stage. And in a very simple way, we were able to kind of present different ideas and different visuals, which, where am I? Yeah, which then sort of, you see sort of a more finished product of what our digital chorus looked like. We were able to kind of isolate them by 3D, by mapping them on these little sort of slits of fabric. We were also able to project by having 1 in the front, and then I think it was 1 behind and 2 up in the sort of ceiling to be able to hit the different walls, the floor, the background, and the front. And the conductor, which you can kind of see there is wearing a headset at different times with the chorus. He had to wear, he had a click track on so that he could see what was coming up next. Our keyboard player was sort of traditionally playing different sound effects and music, but also cueing sound effects. And you can kind of see Rachel there, not just playing a keyboard, but also playing like a MacBook keyboard just above where her right hand is, to trigger those sound effects and cue in different ways. And so I feel like it went off rather well. It was really tricky for these 3 organizations who are doing something brand new, but that's kind of what's exciting when you can do that. You can kind of go into hell, and we also had burlesque dancers as well. So it was kind of a wild ride opera, but it proved really successful, thankfully, due to technology. You could really change things very quickly, and you could adapt what you were doing very quickly as well to have different visuals and colors with sort of minimal set changes from a crew perspective as well. And here is a little, the sound isn't the best, but here's a little taste of the visuals of how that came together, and just a little clip of that. So again, you're hearing the orchestra, but you're also sort of seeing the different sound effects that we had based on, you're also seeing the projections which were used differently, and the mapping based on that fabric. We had aerial work as well. You can see one of the singers up on silks as well. So that was a great sort of project where I learned more about technology and what we can do with opera. And I wanted to decide to see if I could take that into a bigger project, which was a production of Hansel and Gretel last year at the Canadian Opera Company. And the challenge with that one was, should I try to take a production and make it more what I think traditional opera is, or should I start to push the boundaries onto what we could do technologically? And I decided to try that, more technology, given a tight budget, but something that I think we could feasibly do. And I'm going to start a video that has no sound, so we don't need to worry about that. But what you'll see is sort of, we played this at the very beginning of the opera. And this was, again, a partnership with sort of different people. We were able to talk to animators in Banff Center. We were able to speak to people at Google as well and look at map technology. This is an opera that was written in Germany and is sung in German. And what we wanted to do is try to connect it to people today, and also to relate to where we were watching it, which was in Toronto. So during the overture of the whole opera, we were able to play this on the front of the wall when you were seated inside the auditorium. And this is what kind of started the whole opera, to sort of set the table, so to speak, in terms of where this opera was taking place. And we really wanted to show everyone that we were looking to set this opera in the city of Toronto, kind of just on the outskirts of where things would be. And so we were able to get the permission of Google to use this. So kind of what you're seeing is technology that is available kind of online in Google World, I believe it's called, which is kind of like Google Maps, but that's the opera house that the opera was kind of being set in. And then as the music keeps going, we started panning back, and there's the OCAD. We were sort of saying, this is where this family lives. They live in a building and everyone is at home. It was kind of like a pre-pandemic. Who knew what was going to happen? But what we were able to do is, once we got to where we wanted to be in this map, that's where the animation and the animation departments and our video team were able to kind of show what we wanted to show, which was a busy apartment building filled with families and kids. And we were able to film that by using green screen. We were able to film that using actors with some physical objects, some physical tables and chairs. And the rest was kind of all kind of put in afterwards. So even in this video, what you're kind of seeing is snapshots into various rooms in the apartment building, but the actual shooting of this was just that, for example, that young boy on a green screen stage with just the table and chair. And again, with technology, you're able to iris in, you're able to zoom in on this window and this scene. And then we were able to kind of move to another room, which looks like it's in the same building, which it is. But again, this is a whole different clip. And this just had to be done earlier. We couldn't kind of do that on a regular opera timeline, which is kind of, you get into the theater and you have kind of 3 weeks to kind of tech things and set the lighting levels and the video levels. So you just have to know further in advance what the planning could be, but this sort of jived with what the music examples were. And so for us, this was a real sort of big thing to do. It took sort of a different way to see how much time that normally we would spend either moving a set piece or adjusting the lights to sort of having different times to use this. And again, I think it really accomplished the fact of rooting this piece in people and in families and setting it in today and in Toronto. Again, even though this story was originally set in Germany as a fairy tale sung in German. So that's a little bit of use of that one. And here, I think the sound will work. Let's see what happens. This is sort of the full stage version, a quick clip of what happened on stage. So you're seeing the wall. and there's the apartment building. So we kind of blended the video in with the set, and we used the video to kind of change different environments of where they were by using these kids and them using their imagination to sort of change the surrounding around them. And that's the joy that you can do with projections and video, which again has been used in other mediums, but we're just starting to use more and more in opera. And then that led again to sort of, again, where we are in this pandemic, which is being really difficult for the performing arts, because what can we do? What can we do? We can't meet and gather as 2,000 people in the opera house or the ballet that we used to do. So what can we do instead? And so we're seeing a lot of arts organizations looking to take what they do online, and we're seeing a lot of growth, and we're seeing what is successful and what is not successful. And part of that is the visuals, meaning opera and the ballet and performing arts are known for the music side, but what if the visuals don't match up? And that's what I think what we were seeing a lot in the early days of the pandemic. Everyone was really excited to get something up online, but does that visual match with what the sound is? And so what our company looked to do is we were going to present we were looking to present a Messiah, Handel's Messiah, in a theater setting. And we normally take an unorthodox approach to this by choreographing it and adding lighting and costuming, which really stood out differently from the other Handel's Messiahs that were put on by the Toronto Symphony or Taffel Music. This year, when we realized we couldn't, we said, well, let's kind of take this online. And because we can do that, it's kind of structured differently, working with different unions. And so instead we got one person to sing one number for Messiah, and we ended up getting one person from every province and territory across Canada. And through technology, predominantly a lot of Zoom in the early days of planning, but also being able to really do some weird things in terms of how we can navigate a pandemic, but also record music and record video. We were able to capture every sort of scene that we wanted, which was about a 75-minute video of which we called Messiah Complex. And so here's a quick 1-minute trailer of what this was, and then I'll show something else just after that. But here is this. Let's see. So that took a lot of work to put together, but ultimately what we found was if we had gone ahead with our original plans of producing it, we had hoped in a larger theater with a larger audience, even if it was 1,000 people a night for 4 nights, that's 4,000 people. Whereas we got very lucky with this video, but it was viewed over 130,000 times in over 40 different countries. And the reach was incredible for something that was intended for online experience, for digital. And again, the pandemic made us do this decision, and otherwise we wouldn't have. So there are some good things that have come out of this pandemic, but we were able to partner with a much larger organization as well and they were sort of able to kind of work around the technology of what we wanted to do. I've got one other video to just show how how complicated it was even just to record the music. And this is one of the choirs of the Messiah video. Basically, to follow the COVID protocols, we had to record in groups of 9, and the choir had about 45. So it was groups of 9 and then they left, and then groups of 9 and then they left. And they were listening to the orchestra, which was recorded before the singers. So we recorded the orchestra without singers, and then we mixed that to make it sound nice, and then we started adding singers. So you'll hear and sort of see what these singers had to go through in order just to record their vocal part. So there you go. It was really odd. They were singing, their conductor was completely surrounded in plastic. But again, we were able to do this and sort of make it work and stitch these projects together through technology, which again was something that we're all learning about. And I think as we go forward, this sort of digital revolution is not going to go away. That's my belief. And so it's up to certain people and those who want to embrace this to see how we integrate it more in our companies, how we help train up our creators, and sort of not just our creators, but our boards need to know about this, our donors need to know about this, and our audience does as well, to see what could be possible, both when we're able to do this live, but also sort of in this new kind of digital realm. And I think the next steps are just how we as viewers can interact with this as well. How can we sort of create this experience? How can we go even further in terms of integrating it and how we interact with classical music and with art and with opera? So that's kind of a quick overview snapshot of some projects that I've worked on, which have used technology, and how I'm a big believer in it. And I'm looking forward to what the future will be for how we use more of it. And if anyone has any questions, you can ask that as well.
Yeah, so if anybody has it, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or pop in. I've got one to get started. So you mentioned partway through that there are non-tech lovers. Particularly for opera, people like the purity of the original intent of non-amplified, etc. So for the pieces, particularly the one that you actually had to do in front of an audience, what was the reaction from people that may not have necessarily appreciated the level of technology introduced?
Alex, I think part of that is in our publicity or marketing of the piece as well, to make sure that people know what they're coming in for, that they're not expecting something else. I've tried to sort of rename titles that maybe they're familiar with, to make sure that they're not expecting to come see The Marriage of Figaro if it's going to be radically different for them. And inevitably, some people, it blows their mind and they think this is the future of opera, and other people would leave at halftime sort of saying, I'm not coming back. So I think like it depends on what your mind frame is and how open you are to sort of seeing what could be done when you kind of open the door to new ways of technology. But not to toot my own horn, so to speak, but that the Orphe opera, like that won Outstanding Opera of the Year. And I think that was based on just all these innovations which we saw in the piece itself, and that they were done well.
And on those innovations, can you talk a little bit about the costs associated with doing that? Like, obviously there will be new costs. There could also be some savings in being able to do things in new ways. Do you maybe want to talk a little bit about how a lot of this tech can affect budget in a good and a bad way?
Yeah, it's kind of, when, and I don't know if this is controversial, but there's some unions which protect certain groups of people. And when you're part of a company that doesn't have certain obligations, so for example, we didn't have to pay a chorus every night to sing in that opera. And we're an equity organization. If we had, that would have been many, many, many thousands of dollars to do that. Whereas with a digital chorus, once you pay for the creation of it, you're not meaning that robots were kind of replacing people. And we have to be very careful with that, especially once we're dealing with certain things. But also from an orchestra standpoint, we were able to replace volume of players and even certain sounds by having it digitally manufactured. So in a lot of ways, it was not the most expensive show we've ever put on, but the impact was so much greater. So meaning it depends on what you invest and how you invest in that way. It was also a piece that we rehearsed very separately. The dancers kind of did their own thing in a different time period, and we did ours as singers separately, and we were able to bring it all together very quickly, even though it was rehearsed and kind of put together separately in different chunks. So you just have to be open-minded to how you want to think and plan and use it.
So we polled everybody that was invited for questions, and we had a couple that came in. And so we're going to take the next little bit to pose these questions to Chris, Amy, and Stephen, representing their respective organizations. So the first question was, are large organizations willing to work with small organizations or even independent artists who are new to them? Most of us, the artists, would love to work hand in hand with larger companies and have the talent to do so, but not the opportunity to be invited to do this work. What would it take for them, I'm presuming that the large organizations, to open the doors to new collaborations? So Amy, why don't we start with you on that one?
Thank you, Alex. And I want to first of all thank I think it was Ingrid who posed the question. So thank you for a really important question, and it's one that we've been thinking about quite a bit at the Canadian Opera Company for the last little while. And so if I may, I'm going to break it down into several parts, covering some context, my own personal observations, and then sort of dive into where the COC. So these are my observations. In my 15 years of working in the sector, I've had the opportunity to work with small companies. I consider these to be like Joel's, so like Against the Grain Theater. I consider them to be small, creative, nimble, innovative, and really pushing the envelope in terms of the artists that they're engaging with and the impact that they're having on the sector. I've worked with government. Government can be clunky, bureaucratic, slow to change, all of the things that we all experience when we're interacting with government. And then I've worked with the COC, and I like to think of the COC somewhere in the middle of that, probably trending towards the government bureaucratic side, but also there's a lot of creativity and innovation that happens there. And then when I was thinking about how to answer the question, I was thinking about an analogy using bolts and a wave. So what I think is happening in the Canadian opera sector, or the Canadian arts sector as a whole, is that there's this wave that's coming towards us. And it's not a tidal wave, it's not a scary wave, it's just this really exciting wave of change. And so those smaller, nimble boats, they're able to turn their steering really quickly and ride that wave of change into like a really, really bright future. At the government level, they're sort of driving right into the wave. They're telling every other boat that this wave is coming. They're talking about change, but we're not starting to see the real change that we want to see. And then like the comparison to the two different entities, the COC is somewhere in the middle. So we're turning the wheel, but because our boat is a bit bigger, it's a little more difficult for the change that we all want to see to be actually perceived by our audiences. So clearly in training, and then to talk about where we've been, where we currently are right now, and where we're going. So where we've been is in the 1980s, we established what we called the Ensemble Studio, and it's a small training program. It has grown over the years, but really meant to identify and train the next generation of opera singers. And we've been at that for about 30 years, maybe closer to 40 now. In sort of the early 21st, or the early 21st century, sort of the early 2000s, we started to identify an opportunity for us to go a little bit deeper with that work. So I think it was around 2010. So later on, after the economic crisis in the 2007, 2008, we established what we called our company in residence. And so our first company in residence was Against the Grain Theater. And the intent of the program was to help that organization go from, a small upstart, really innovative and creative company without structures around it, to encourage like really, really big growth, and for us to invest resources, to invest both human and financial resources, to enable them to move on their journey from a smaller company to one that is more established and more able to move beyond the indie company idea. So where we are now, that's where we've been. Where are we now? So now, the recent announcement that we had at the beginning of this year was what we are calling our disruptor in residence. And so this disruptor in residence is called Amplified Opera, and they're young, innovative, diverse creators working in the field of opera that have recognized a really, really challenging thing in that the structures of the older companies are not as porous to be able to bring new people and new voices in. So where are we on our journey? We're approaching this as a shared learning opportunity, that it's not just about us being the COC, investing resources and financial and human resources in developing Amplified Opera. It's also an opportunity for us, the COC, to really examine how we engage with new artists who are saying, we want in and we want to work with you. So we're kind of at the beginning of this journey with Amplified Opera, but it's starting to inform our ideas about how we can continue to open up our organization for deeper engagement and creating a more level playing field for artists from all diverse backgrounds, diverse disciplines, to really think differently about how we do opera at the COC. What do I think is next for us? So I'm sort of thinking in the 6 to 12 month period. I think that opportunities like this for engagement, opportunities to work with organizations like CPAMO, is really important for us. One of the things that we recognize is that we have a great deal to learn, and it's not good enough for us to say, we're building this program, we hope you participate. I think what we've discovered over the last little while is that a great deal of trust and relationship building needs to happen before this work really gets off the ground. And I think back to the efforts that we've made in terms of engagement with Indigenous communities around our Circle of Artists. And we've been working with them since 2017. And it's taken us this long to create an environment where they trust us. So I think we're taking that approach. And when I say it feels like it's really slow, it does. It can feel glacial. I'm sure the pace feels glacial, but it is happening. The conversations are occurring, and I think we're going to start seeing change in organizations like the COC in the next little while. So I hope that goes part of the way to answering the question. I think the big answer is yes, we are willing, we are open. How do we now build an opportunity and an environment for this kind of creation and this kind of collaboration between organizations and new companies and new voices? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris, I think, who has some perspective to share from the ballet's point of view.
Okay, so I spoke with our executive director, and the system that we put in place, or the program that we put in place, is actually part of our creative action program. I'll just drop the link in the chat just so people can see that. If I could call up the chat. There it is. Make sure. So the Creative Action Program was curated, and it's the brainchild of Robert Benet and Karen Kane. The idea behind it is a way in which the National Ballet can connect with and work with choreographers and dancers within the Greater Toronto area. And it's divided into sort of 3 programs. One is the choreographic workshop. The choreographic workshop started, I believe, as a way for us to work with the dancers within the company doing choreography, but then they decided to expand it to choreographers outside of the company, and the opportunity to work with new and emerging choreographers and give them access to National Ballet dancers and the National Ballet facilities as a way to learn and work and develop their choreography. So that's one component. The next component of creative action is actually open space. And the idea behind open space was simply, we have facilities that not everyone has. And when we are in the theater at the Four Seasons Center, our dance studios just sat empty. So the feeling was that we have an opportunity to provide that out. So we have 1,200 hours of free studio space that we offer. Unfortunately, due to COVID, it's currently suspended. But the idea is that when we're in theater, our studios are available. You can put in an application and you can get up to, I believe, a week's worth of studio time at the National Ballet to use our dance facilities. So that's a really interesting piece. And then the last one that we're doing is micro commissions. So every year, the ballet will work with 3 new choreographers to create new micro commissions to sort of focus on new innovative dance work. So this program, so far, we've had 47 different individuals or organizations in the past 2 years, not this year, obviously. And as a matter of fact, one of those individuals, Alyssa Pyers, started with the Creative Action Open Space program and is now an associate choreographer with the ballet. So there's some really interesting opportunities within the ballet to try to reach out. And I put the link in the chat, and I suggest that, you know, once the ballet is able to open up again, take a look at that information and put in an application and research it. And we invite you to join us. So hopefully that answers the question.
Excellent. Thank you. There's actually a question in the chat for Amy. So, in engaging Indigenous and communities of color, will the COC consider opera in non-European languages? In engaging artists of diverse backgrounds, might the company consider how to reflect their cultures aesthetically?
Thank you for the question. It's an excellent one. So I'm going to frame it again. I don't want you to think that I'm dodging the question. I'm not. What I want to impart is that we're sort of at the beginning of this work. But one of the principles that's guiding our work is that if we listen to people outside of our organization, we will create opportunities inside of our organization that will begin to demonstrate our willingness and our desire and our celebration of this co-collaboration. So, humble caveat, I am not an influencer or a power holder when it comes to the art that we produce. I can sort of guide the company in a direction, understanding the sector, understanding where society is going, but I'm not yet, I'm not in a position to speak to exactly how our art will change. Where I think that we'll start to see significant change in the future is the communities in which we're engaging with. And then again, it's that idea of collaboration and co-creation, and not the COC coming with a built program to work with a community, but rather to engage with a community, to co-collaborate, to co-create, and to tell stories from their perspectives. In terms of performing opera in non-European languages, it is something that's on my mind. I think about it as in terms of accessibility. One of the things that we do have at the Four Seasons Center are surtitles that project English, of course, onto the proscenium above the stage. And I think now that we're talking about technology and how technology can enhance the audience experience, we do have an opportunity to see whether or not there are ways for that technology to be translated into all of the amazing languages that are heard and spoken in Toronto, so that we can take a piece of accessibility that was built around European languages and now share it in the language of the diverse inhabitants of Toronto. Whether or not we get to a point of seeing on our stage non-European languages, I think that's probably a longer term goal. It's not something that will happen in a 3 to 5 year period. And I'll just say that's because typically speaking, our planning cycles are that long. So if you're seeing something in 2022, it's something that we planned in 2017. So while all of this change at the grassroots level is happening, I want this group to know that we're hearing the desire and the need and the directional change that the COC needs to take. And there is work being done behind the scenes, sadly not as open as we would like it to be. Perhaps one day we'll get there soon, but the work is being done and the questions are being asked. And I think the change is going to come very soon. Great.
Again, if anybody has any questions or follow-up questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. I've got another one here, and it builds off of something that I asked Joel earlier. It's around funding, and specifically technology funding. So we know that a lot of the stuff that we've seen today and in the last few weeks costs dollars. And as challenging as it is for everybody, it's even more challenging for small, medium, and individual artists. So is there any kind of collaborative pot of money to access to be able to explore some of these technologies? Maybe I'll start with Chris.
I don't know necessarily a pot of money, but there is the funding that the Canada Council has provided through the digital strategy funds. So as an example, the Digital Reach project that the ballet and the opera are working together on, we currently have a project that we've created called Expanding the Canvas. And it was actually a riff on the choreographic workshop concept, which is, as you all know, Stephen, Alex, and myself were tech guys, and sitting around a table, we can talk about tech. But there was a realization that we didn't know what to do with the tech. We could just tell you what it does. So the idea with the choreographic workshop was, well, if we took really creative, smart choreographers and artists and creators and gave them the tech, what would they do with it? And so that created this idea of expanding the canvas. If we created a larger canvas using technology, what could happen with it. And so working with the Canadian Music Theatre Project and the CERT Center, we came up with this idea of let's invite people to a workshop at CERT and show them what's available, and then invite those individuals to put in an application to use some of that tech with a concept. Now, originally, pre-COVID, the plan was to do an open call. Unfortunately, due to COVID, that just wasn't possible. So as a first phase, we decided to do something that was much more curated. But the idea behind it was that each organization would reach out to people that they had not worked with within the community, individuals that they've seen that they wanted to work with, and invite them to this workshop. So we invited 12 artists. This was also in conjunction with the Royal Opera and the Royal Ballet. And we invited 12 individuals, exposed them to different types of technology, and then said, if you had access to some of these things, what would you do? And so now we're in the process. The applications have been submitted, and we're doing a review. But the idea is to do a 5-minute demo proof of concept, fully funded. So the individuals were invited to the initial workshop. Then we did a one-on-one mentoring session, talking about their ideas. Then they were to submit their idea, and then we're going to have a panel go through and review them, put them also through a technology filter to make sure that what they're proposing is actually possible. And then we'll pick 3 to 5 of the works and help them actually do a 5-minute demo. And the purpose is also to create an opportunity for learning about the type of technology. So there will be a white paper, an explanation of what was used, how it was used, the concept behind it, and then publish that out to the larger community so that people can see what the potential of technology is. And it's those types of projects that we're working on. So Paddle, which I can let Stephen and Amy talk about, is probably the next evolution at all of this. So this proof of concept of, hey, here's what technology is, but then we have the Paddle project, which is now we're actually going to create a lab where we can provide risk-free access to that technology. And in conjunction with that, the other project that we're working on is our larger scale video project through the Four Seasons Center, where we're outfitting the opera and the ballet and the Four Seasons Center with video capture equipment. And now there's a discussion about, we're in the planning phases about how we make that accessible to the larger community, and then whether or not we can, and what type of training programs we'll put forward so that we can actually have the community come in and learn how to use the technology and understand being able to capture and create and direct, dance and art capturing. So Steve, did you want to comment, or Amy, do you want to comment on Paddle?
Sure. I mean, and just to sort of pull it back to Alex's question around shared pool or resource of funds. I mean, the idea behind the Performing Arts Digital Lab is to create a resource for the sector. So while it's not exactly a pool of funding, it is still a resource with its own funding that is meant to be available for anybody in the sector who comes forward and wants to try something new in an environment that stands alone from their own respective production environment, to allow a risk-free opportunity to try something new, where the success or failure of that idea, much like what Joel was saying with his work at the Banff Center, the success or failure is not material to the outcome. It's about being able to express yourself in a new and exciting way. And ideally, we're trying to then share all of those successes and failures with the broader community as well, so that we can all benefit from those learnings. Because at the end of the day, this is, to go back to Amy's analogy of the wave, this is all coming for us all, and we all are excited by it, and we all hope to be risen up at the same time.
Yeah, and I just because I came off of a conversation with Canada Council earlier this morning, you know, I think there is a sensitivity to the post recovery period for the Canadian performing arts sector. I think we have a real opportunity to talk about, and I'm going to use Joe Biden's phrase, but talk about building back better, because I think we have all identified that what has been built in the past is simply not serving the needs of today. So how do we work collaboratively to ensure, again, and then I'm going to go back to my boat analogy, but to ensure that this rising tide is going to lift all of the boats, because you know, this amazing cultural sector in Canada has been built up over generations, and in 2 years it could be decimated by a real tragedy, and I don't think anybody wants to see that. I don't think Canada Council wants to see that. I don't think our federal government wants to see it. So how do we work together to embrace all of the changes that 21st century Canadian society is demanding of us? It's something that we're thinking about continually at the Canadian Opera Company. I'm sure the conversation is happening at the National Ballet of Canada as well, and all of the large institutions, about the role and responsibility we have to ensure, you know, opera companies, ballet companies, theater companies, into the next generation for our kids and our grandchildren as well.
And so following up on the budget question, training, and that's always a challenge. It's one thing to actually have the money to get the equipment. It's a whole other, usually pot of money that somebody would be required to spend on training of the equipment. Amy, I know you've got a few perspectives on training, so maybe you can start this conversation.
Yeah, so training is something that's really important to the Canadian Opera Company. I talked a little bit about our ensemble studio, the evolution of that, now how we've got our disruptor in residence, our composer in residence, we had a dramaturg in residence, and now we're thinking a little bit further about how we can expand that even further, with paying particular attention to access for Indigenous, Black, and people of color artists and communities. So over the next, 6 to 12 months, and again, I like to talk in those terms because I'd like to do it tomorrow, but we have a program to build. Over the next 6 to 12 months, what the COC will be doing is having a look at the human and digital infrastructure resources that we have, and whether or not there's an opportunity to build a program around those resources, providing access to training, access and training for Indigenous, Black, and people of color artists. Again, I think what we need to do, and I was speaking to Charles about this earlier, what we need to do as a company, again, this is talking about collaboration, partnership building, and trust building. I think it requires us to consult. It's not something that we're going to build independent from hearing the voices of the community who are looking for this kind of opportunity. So in the next little while, I mean, I'll begin with Charles because he and I have a great relationship. We'll start talking about how something like this can evolve and how can we serve the needs of a community. So I'll start there. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in.
In terms of the ballet, I'm not sure. There's been a lot of discussions about how to move forward with a lot of the training. The work that we're doing with Creative Action was sort of the first phase of that, which is to provide that type of access, specifically the choreographic workshop, and being able to have choreographers come in and work with them one-on-one and help them develop their craft. That's from the artistic side. In terms of the technology side, that there is discussions, and we will be joining the COC in those discussions and sort of working to figure out if there's a joint program that could be put together because of the integration of technology that we're doing. But we're still trying to figure all of that out as well. So those are things that are coming up, and will be continued conversations. I know that amongst us, the evolution of paddle is the next project, which is something called ACT, and we're just waiting to hear from the Canada Council as to whether or not that's something that will get funded. ACT, which is the Arts and Culture Technology Trust. One of the areas that we've been talking a lot about is can ACT be a hub between arts institutions, the technology sector, and the education sector? And what's that relationship? What's the pipeline so that we can bring technology into the arts and culture industry, but also bring education along? So working with specifically Sheridan, but there's also discussions about Ryerson and the different universities to figure out what that relationship is, because it's one thing to have technology, but if you don't have the people to operate it, and live performing arts specifically is such a different beast than film and television than that. So it needs to be very catered. So those would be discussions that we're having, is to figure out what those programs look like, what the access is, and how that will work. But we do need to figure out what that hub is, so that not only are we providing the technology and access to it, but we actually have a way to train people so that we're constantly bringing in new individuals and supporting the infrastructure that we're trying to put in place.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that to say that one of the things philosophically we're talking about is how do we keep skills up to date in a constant way. And so by establishing those relationships, especially when we're talking about technology, which is constantly changing, we'll be able to refresh in a you know, much like any other development life cycle you might look at. It's something circular. You keep starting over and over again. You know, you've never really arrived. In other words, it's always about iteration and looking for the next bit of improvement. So I think with technology, we're certainly trying to keep mindful of that. I would say as well that in the early days when we're talking about technologies for the performing arts sector today, we're trying to find things, and certainly all of the projects we've kicked off have a series of guiding principles to them. And usually one of the very first guiding principles is that it's got to be something, you know, that's within a relative skill set, easy to use and to manage. And, you know, while that won't always be possible with technology, it is something that we look to try to push the envelope on, to make sure that, you know, the workers within our sector will be able to use this technology with the appropriate training. In other words, it's not something so monumentally different that it would be an impossibility. So within the spectrum of technology, and it is all like all things, a spectrum, there's a place where you can enter into the fray, so to speak, and ensure yourself that you're not going to be taking on something impossible to begin with.